There's few more egregious offences than bringing back established, well-known heroic characters beloved by generations of moviegoers and systematically degrading, discrediting and destroying not just who they are now, but everything they once were, usually in a desperate attempt to elevate some cheap, soulless carbon copy replacement that lacks everything which made the original so appealing in the first place. It's a cheap thing for any writer to do, and yet it seems to be happening at an alarming rate these days. Modern Hollywood likes to refer to this process as deconstruction.
So, that was a quote from the Critical Drinkers, aka Will Jordan's video titled "Why Modern Movies Suck, They're Destroying Our Heroes." The word he used at the end there, deconstruction, is a word that's thrown around a lot these days, and something Will has a big problem with, as made clear by his many videos where he maligns this course of writing. But because that word is used so often these days, I got to thinking, what does it actually mean? And is it as big a problem as Will would have you believe? So we're going to talk about deconstruction in the academic and common vernacular sense, and we're going to look at a few of Will's videos to understand why it bothers him so much. In the clip we just saw, Will uses Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, Sarah Connor, and Rocky/Creed as his examples of deconstruction. Sarah Connor is especially hilarious because you know he would hate that character if Terminator 2 came out today. But go ahead and put a pin in that as we talk about deconstruction. Obviously, the most apparent meaning of the word deconstruction is to disassemble something, to take something apart. By that definition, any work that takes familiar tropes and attempts to put a new spin on them could be seen as a deconstruction, as it's theoretically taking something apart. So in that sense, Will isn't technically wrong when he labels these things deconstructions, even if one could argue that Star Wars Episode 8 isn't all that deconstructionist, but we can get into that later. The point is, deconstruction as a label can be applied pretty liberally in the colloquial sense. However, in the literary criticism sense, deconstruction has a more specific meaning. As per the Poetry Foundation, deconstruction posits that meaning as accessed through language is indeterminate because language itself is indeterminate. It is a system of signifiers that can never fully mean. A word can refer to an object but can never be that object. Used as a method of literary critique, deconstruction refocuses attention on a work as open-ended, endlessly available to interpretation, and far beyond the reach of authorial intention. Deconstruction traces how language generates meaning both within a text and across texts, while insisting that such meaning can only ever be provisional. And as YouTuber Tim Nance puts it so well in his video on the topic, all deconstructionist criticism has an implicit irony because, according to deconstructionists, language has no meaning, so the criticism itself ultimately amounts to the same outcome as the work it's criticizing. So it's less about the conclusion and more about the process. Perhaps then it's no surprise that Will has no interest in deconstruction because truly thinking about art on a deeper level doesn't really seem to be his thing. And for more on that, you can watch my video about his thoughts on theme, which I'll refer to a couple times in this video. And lastly, before we get back to Will, I just want to read this quote from Maria Tomasco from her paper Trajectories of Research in Translation Studies. In this bit, Tomasco is commenting on the Igbo words for translation, tapia and kawa. Tapia comes from the roots ta, tell, narrate, and pia, destruction, break it up, with the overall sense of deconstruct it and tell it in a different form. Kawa has a similar meaning derived from ka, narrate, talk about, and wa, break in pieces. In Igbo, therefore, translation is an activity that stresses the viability of communication as narration, allowing for decomposition and change in form rather than one-to-one reconstruction. So by this philosophy, even when you're relating a movie to somebody else, even when you're summarizing it or giving a review of it, you are translating it. You are breaking it down and changing it. One might argue that everything Will does on his channel is deconstruction, but the important thing to take away from Tomasco here is the theoretical implication. When we talk about something, we break it into pieces. To quote Alan Moore in an interview conducted by Barry Kavanagh, obviously, if you're going to be doing something new, then to a degree, you're destroying whatever preceded it. So with that framework in mind, let's return to Will's initial video on deconstruction. In discussing Han and Luke in the sequel trilogy, he says,
"The intended messages in both cases is pretty clear. The heroes that you used to look up to will ultimately end up failing, regressing into their old ways, and letting you down. And to be honest, they really weren't all that good to begin with, so you need to stop looking up to them and just forget about them now.
That's a strange reading of the movie, considering Luke's comeback at the end. In fact, The Last Jedi doesn't feel like much of a deconstruction at all. Based on what we see in the movie, it seems to deny its own naysaying. Rey doesn't join Kylo Ren, she takes the Jedi texts and carries on in the Jedi way. Luke ultimately bounces back and becomes the symbol he had always been. The only thing that feels truly deconstructionist about The Last Jedi is Rey's heritage. That feels genuinely subversive of the Star Wars formula. But then, of course, The Rise of Skywalker had to roll around and backpedal there. And let me be clear, I don't like Rey as a character. I find her profoundly uninteresting. But that's not to say taking Luke in this direction was strictly the wrong approach. As Man Carrying Things said in his video on The Drinker,
you don't have to like The Last Jedi or what they did with Luke's character, but it is like a classic trope. It's just a way to bring in these legacy characters and give them an arc. It can be done well and it can be done poorly.
Exactly. But The Drinker, as many people including myself have pointed out, seems incapable of understanding nuance. His framing is never, well, this trope, like all tropes, can be done well or poorly. No, his perspective seems to be, this trope is always bad no matter what, and once again, put a pin in that.
All of these characters that used to exemplify the most positive aspects of human nature have been twisted and warped into obscene parodies of themselves, tarnishing not just who they are now, but who they once were as well.
I suppose I can sympathize with The Drinker's anger here, but I think he's missing the forest for the trees. He's so concerned and torn up over the fact that these characters regress that he doesn't seem to recognize how they go through an arc and ultimately come out on top again. If The Drinker is so concerned with human nature as he claims in that clip, then he should love this sort of thing. Is it not in our nature to often go one step forward and two steps back, or vice versa? I've said it before, but all stories are about what it means to be human, and good people in real life don't always stay good. No one in the real world learns one important lesson and then remains perfect for the rest of their lives. We are constantly changing, and for some people I feel it would be good to see that in legacy characters. It lets us know it's never too late. But hey, real quick, are you sick of AI popping up almost everywhere in everyday life? Perhaps most annoying is its presence in writing software. I hate going to write a script or a poem and having to immediately close the AI assistant that pops up. What's more, even if there's no AI assistant, word processors are likely using your writing to train AI. If you're as fed up with it as I am, there's a free, safe, ethical alternative out there, the sponsor of today's video, Ellipsis. Ellipsis is a company founded by writers for writers. With Ellipsis, you have the guarantee that your writing will never be used to train AI, and your personal information will never be sold to any third party. With Ellipsis' emphasis on humanity and community, they offer monthly newsletters, human-made templates for your inspiration, and a Discord server where you can find collaborators and accountability partners. Ellipsis makes it easier than ever to comment on work and integrate feedback from others on your work. You can use the QR code on screen or the link in the description and pinned comment to start using Ellipsis today completely for free. Writers deserve better tools, and there are lots of big things coming with Ellipsis. There's no better time to get on board than right now. Thanks so much to Ellipsis for sponsoring this video. But with that, Will recommended we check out his review of Creed to hear more of his thoughts on how Hollywood takes a dump on its heroes, I guess. Regarding Rocky's portrayal in Creed, Will says,
Rocky was always about perseverance in the face of adversity, determination to succeed and triumph against the odds. He might have been a humble boxer and not all that bright, but he represented everything that was good and noble about the human spirit. Even a drunken like me could appreciate him. Now I guess Ryan Coogler felt he needed to be deconstructed, because that's what we're all about these days, right? Picking heroic characters apart, because everything and everyone we used to look up to has to be broken down and diminished.
If Rocky is all about perseverance in the face of adversity and triumph against the odds, doesn't his arc in Creed fit snugly into that model? But I feel there's something else going on with this opinion. The language here makes it sound like the drinker takes Creed as a personal slight against him. It's as if everything he perceives being done to Rocky is being done to him. Perhaps I'm extrapolating too much, but this is the sort of thing it feels like the drinker is always raving about. The past used to be so uncomplicated. Everything made sense. There was good and bad, and nothing more complex. There were straight white male heroes, and anything contrary to that was a slap in the face to goodness and normalcy. I must sound like a broken record, but it feels like Will is so unwilling to engage with any of this because he doesn't want to engage in any form of self-examination.
You see how writing a character with all these constraints and issues to work around just leaves you with a weird, inconsistent mess that has no obvious flaws, personality, or character arc. It's what I call the Ray effect. They wanted a hero to go on the classic hero's journey, but the problem is that part of the hero's journey involves struggling, losing, and failing in order to grow and learn. And because Ray is a product of identity politics and third wave feminism, she can't be allowed to fail or lose at anything, especially to a man. So instead of the peaks and troughs of the hero's journey, what you end up with is an abbreviated straight line of endless domination. That's why people like us, who actually appreciate good storytelling, can't get behind these characters, because they recognise there's something fundamentally missing.
Whew, there's a lot to dig into in just that one clip. Notice how he says, people like us, fundamentally establishing an in-group and an out-group between people who quote-unquote enjoy good storytelling and people who don't. It can't just be that some people like some films and other people like other films with some amount of overlap. No. We're working with very objective, black and white measures here. But setting that aside, this talk about the hero's journey and facing trials is rather interesting. Now, personally, I honestly am a big proponent of the hero's journey. I think it's tried and true, it works. But it's obviously not the only way to tell a story, and deconstructionists are always questioning these structures just as they question language and meaning themselves. Creed is such a strange example to point to because Adonis, Donnie, does face a lot of trials in this movie. Donnie isn't accepted into the Delphi Boxing Academy, and then he's beaten by Danny the stuntman Wheeler. He goes to jail after letting his anger get the better of him and beating up someone who compares him to his dad. He also, spoiler alert, loses the fight at the end of the movie. To say Adonis doesn't go through trials is just blatantly ignoring the text. But I suppose that kind of behavior from Will shouldn't surprise us, should it? Also, calling Ray a product of identity politics and third-wave feminism feels weird, to say the least. Reportedly, George Lucas also wanted a female lead for his sequel trilogy. Would that have been a product of third-wave feminism and identity politics too? Or is it just because Ray doesn't seem to face much adversity? I agree that that's uninteresting, but again, in that case, it's weird that we're comparing Ray to Adonis. So a few months ago, at the time of writing this script, Will released another video along these lines called Make Fantasy Heroic Again. At the beginning of this video, he praises HBO's A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, saying,
"But there's an underlying feeling that the show actually has a moral compass, that it knows the difference between good and evil, between hero and villain, and it's not ashamed or self-conscious about any of that."
So this is revealing for a few reasons. Apparently, the only media with a moral compass is media that delineates who the good and evil guys are. Maybe you could call that a mischaracterization of what he said, but it's not hard to interpret it that way. Perhaps more interesting, though, is the implication that modern media is ashamed of the idea of a strict good and evil, or is self-conscious about it. That supposition reveals something about the drinker's thoughts on modern media as a whole. I guess, in the drinker's mind, the only reason a writer might employ nuance is because they find the binaries of good and evil dumb, or beneath them. That, to me, seems to be the implication. Listen to what the drinker had to say in his video called Andor Finally Got Me.
"It's slow pace, gritty but infrequent action, labyrinthine storylines, and complex, mature, and, yeah, slightly sterile characters didn't fit all that well with a franchise that was always about grand adventures, epic storytelling, big emotional beats, and clearly defined good and evil."
This is a show he likes, a show with pretty clearly defined good guys and bad guys. But even here, he cannot handle any complication. Nuance would seem to be his kryptonite. This acknowledgement is extremely important because it reveals that no, we don't have to adhere to binaries. Characters can be complicated, multi-layered, and have a broad range of motivations besides just good and evil. But in Will's video on deconstruction, he would never admit this. Let's get back to the video on fantasy.
There's something deeply wrong with the fantasy genre today, isn't there? For all the smart writing that's trying so desperately hard to subvert your expectations, the self-aware characters and the flashy special effects, there's something kind of empty and unsatisfying about modern fantasy. It just doesn't move you on that deeper emotional level.
Again, it's fascinating that the drinker thinks a writer's goal is, I guess, to sound smart, to be subversive and self-aware rather than I don't know, just right? Maybe a lot of fantasy is subversive and self-aware, but that doesn't mean it's not also focused on telling a good story. As mentioned, a lot of deconstructionist writing is inherently self-aware, because it recognizes that language can have no inherent meaning. Thinking of some fantasy novels I've read somewhat recently, Circe and Thistlefoot are both self-aware, but not in the way that you'd expect. Circe is in dialogue with Greek mythology and the Odyssey, while Thistlefoot is in dialogue with the legends of Baba Yaga. As such, both of these works are going to be inherently metatextual. They're commenting on myths and legends and intrinsically have something to say about language and storytelling. But even works that aren't explicit retellings have to acknowledge their own history. When writing in the tradition of a genre, it's not possible to set aside conventions. Perhaps when writing is, on its face, trying to sound subversive or self-aware, maybe there's a reason for it. And not just a metatextual reason, but a reason that's in service to the story. Remember how I said Rey's lack of important heritage was the most interesting thing about her character? That feels like the closest she ever really gets to grappling with something, and it's not just a meta-commentary on Star Wars, but it's a moment where Rey is compelling as a person. Despite being led to believe she was special, her lineage would say otherwise. So how does she grapple with that? She has decisions to make in the face of that revelation. It's engaging.
Morality, meaning and purpose were all sacrificed in favour of nihilistic subversion and smug deconstruction to be the cool kid on the block for a couple of years. The problem is, though, cool isn't very deep. Cool is nothing more than surface level flashiness with nothing more substantial or meaningful to back it up.
Again, it's interesting that he thinks a writer's only goal is to impress the audience rather than tell a story. And let's be real, sometimes that is a writer's goal, but to generalize in such a broad way is pretty narrow-minded. Also, the logic feels kind of backwards, doesn't it? He says the goal in being nihilistic or subversive is coolness, and coolness isn't very deep. But on the surface, wouldn't it be more deep than just strictly defined parameters of good and evil? And obviously that's not always going to be the case, don't let me generalize either. But I can't help but feel he's contradicting himself. Does he want his media to be deep, or does he want it to be straightforward? And it certainly can be both, but I'm not sure that's what the drinker is really arguing for here. Based on the way he criticizes labyrinthian storytelling, and based on the way he criticizes other movies and theme, I don't think he wants deep whatsoever. In discussing House of the Dragon, the drinker says,
I don't really care which side wins because why should I? There's nothing to root for in any of them. There's not a single character I'd aspire to or find endearing or even particularly likable.
The idea that characters, especially main characters, have to be likable seems to be one of the biggest misconceptions in all of fiction. Alyssa Matesic puts it better than I can.
Sometimes, in an attempt to write a likable character, writers will sacrifice depth, which is what actually makes us connect with a character.
Remember how depth is something Will cares about so much rather than just being cool? Alyssa puts forward Patrick Bateman, Joe Goldberg, and Dexter Morgan as examples of protagonists whom you're not supposed to like, but you nonetheless want to follow. My mind also jumps to Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, as well as Marceau from The Stranger. Interesting how many famous killer protagonists there are in fiction. Of course, based on Will's thoughts about Midsommar, I suppose he thinks these characters are worthless.
Time and time again, there's this bizarre urge in writing to reframe the moral positions of established characters and factions and blur the lines between good and evil. Why? Well, I'll tell you. Because in the minds of Hollywood writers, every single thing has to reflect the world we live in today, regardless of context. Because why use imagination when you can employ clumsy allegory instead? The problem is, the world we live in today is messy and complex and morally confused and filled with conflicting viewpoints and perspectives where one man's villain is another man's hero. And hear me out on this one, but isn't the whole point of fantasy to escape the world we live in today? Isn't that why the genre exists in the first place?
Remember old time? Remember old time when thing was good and thing was clear and no thing was complex? Old time's so much better than now time. You remember, don't you? My Scottish accent is terrible. It's such a disingenuous shtick. I've talked about this before, but with hindsight, of course we only remember the books and stories that stand the test of time. But what's more, even in their own times, these stories were commentary on their present world. Otherwise, what good would they have been? And again, with hindsight, of course we understand who was good and who was bad. And it's a shame that people can't recognize how history repeats itself and the fact that they're on the wrong side of it. We might even consider a series of films that Will enjoys, Star Wars Episodes 4, 5, and 6. George Lucas has said on more than one occasion that the original trilogy is an allegory for the Vietnam War, and even with that being the case, they are still a gripping series of movies even when divorced from that allegory, and I imagine Will would agree. Of course, if you were to ask Will, he'd say the only value in a story is its sense of escapism. And I don't know, man. I feel like there's something bleak about that. Like, I discussed the anti-intellectualism of that position already in my themes video. But then there's the idea that stories shouldn't be reflections of our own real world. And why not? Do stories have nothing to teach us? What is it about the real world that Will wants to escape so badly? Like I've said before, it feels like he's avoiding self-reflection at all costs, but also any reminder of the world at large. And why? Is his life really so bad that he needs to be distracted from it by all the media that he consumes? I don't know, am I wrong to feel weird about this?
Why put your own creation out there when you can smugly deconstruct someone else's and call it art?
This feels like a pretty extreme discounting of how many pieces of art are responses to other pieces of art. We're definitely living in an age of literature where retellings are all the rage, but they're nothing new. Even many of the works of Shakespeare were, in their time, not original ideas, but retellings of stories people would have already known. And, as I pointed out, even works that aren't retellings are in dialogue with storytelling on the whole, especially genre pieces. But speaking of retellings, Will clearly hates it when familiar characters regress, go through similar trials as previous ones, and go through all new character arcs. Or does he? In my video on theme, I said that the drinker was dishonest and inconsistent, and I think the following examples will demonstrate that. In the cases of Into the Spider-Verse, Top Gun Maverick, and Cobra Kai, Will doesn't mind at all that beloved characters seem to have regressed and are made to learn lessons all over again. Will doesn't have a video on Into the Spider-Verse, but in his video on the sequel, he says,
For me, Into the Spider-Verse was one of those weird little movies that kinda came out of nowhere way back in 2018. An animated feature film about a character I didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about that ended up being way smarter, more inventive, better written and emotionally engaging than 90% of the live-action movies being squirted out these days.
How strange that Will seemingly has no problem with what Into the Spider-Verse did to Peter Parker. Let's not mince words here. Peter is a loser in the first Spider-Verse movie. Peter B. Parker, that is. He's washed up, he's depressed, he wears sweatpants for the majority of his screen time, and he very much seems past his prime, until he goes on his emotional journey, of course. Is he really so far off from Luke in Episode 8? Why didn't Drinker have a problem with this deconstruction of a very iconic character? Oh, but wait, how did he feel about Peter in the sequel?
Also, I can't shake the feeling that the script is doing everything in its power to play down Peter Parker, like it's afraid the audience will somehow start rooting for him over Miles if he's shown to be too capable and confident. The first movie portrayed him as an aging, burned out loser who only redeems himself at the end, while the second film morphs him into a bumbling, hapless father in a pink bathrobe who for some reason keeps taking his baby along on life-threatening adventures despite having a perfectly capable mother at home to look after it. Is this some weird attempt to mock and belittle the Spider-Man that most people know and love, who incidentally just happens to be the only straight white man in the entire movie? I don't know, man, it just kind of leaves a sour taste in my mouth, that's all.
You've probably seen that clip before, and I'm sorry you had to see it again. But notice how Will can acknowledge Peter's portrayal in the first movie and seemingly has no problem with it. But the sight of Peter in a pink bathrobe, that's way over the line, man. And to call him bumbling and hapless? He's comic relief, for sure, but he's just as much comic relief in the first movie, too. And, as one of Will's commenters noted, Peter is the only one to catch up with Miles. No other Spider-Person can manage that. In fact, a lot of Will's comments here refute his stance on Peter in this movie. Seems like Will is pretty selective about when deconstruction and reinterpretation bother him. As for Top Gun's sequel, Will says,
It's not exactly a complex story, because just like the original, it doesn't really need to be. Top Gun was never some labyrinthine tale with shocking twists and revelations. It was about putting a bunch of young hotheads together into a highly competitive environment and just watching what happens.
There's that word again, labyrinthian. Will really hates anything that's labyrinthian, doesn't he? I wonder what that threshold looks like for him. At what point does a story become too complex? because apparently Across the Spider-Verse doesn't meet that threshold despite everything it's got going on. Again, it kind of just feels like the drinker prescribes certain terms to projects he doesn't like. But when he does like something, those words don't apply. But anyway, back to Maverick.
One of my big fears going into this movie is that it would fall victim to the fucking mind virus that is postmodernism, deciding to mock and belittle the macho, gung-ho mindset of the first film in a desperate attempt to elevate its own story. But nope, it absolutely never does. Top Gun Maverick is a different beast. In the hands of a different filmmaker, Maverick probably would have been portrayed as some sad, decrepit old man desperately trying to relive his glory days before being put firmly in his place by some obnoxious box-ticking fantasy figure and finally coming to the conclusion that he was never really that good in the first place.
Will goes on to say that such tactics are for losers. He also goes on to say Maverick is older now and has more baggage to carry, which I personally think is an understatement. Also, he doesn't mention the fact that a lot of the characters in the movie do belittle Maverick until he ultimately proves himself. Again, it just feels like picking and choosing in order to affix binaries and black and white rules, rather than suggesting that one thing can be done well or poorly depending on the execution. And with that in mind, let's move on to Cobra Kai.
If this all sounds like a cliched load of nostalgic bullshit, then prepare to have your expectations subverted, and not in a Rian Johnson kind of way.
Can you imagine being as obsessed with a man as the critical drinker is with Rian Johnson? This is what happens when you make hating one movie your entire personality.
Johnny and Daniel are the clear focus of this series, and it's interesting to see how they've changed and developed over the years.
Why is it that Johnny and Daniel are allowed to change and develop over the years as opposed to other characters? By the drinker's standards, it seems like these two should have remained the same after the first Karate Kid movie. They should have both stuck with the lessons they learned, never regressing in any way. The difference is, with Cobra Kai, I think the drinker thinks this show confirms his own worldviews. But hold that thought for a second.
The point here is that all of the characters in Cobra Kai feel fleshed out and complex in a way that very few shows manage to do nowadays. Nobody is 100% good or bad, they're all varying shades of grey. Everyone has reasons for being who they are and what they are, and how you perceive them very much comes down to your own personal perspective.
How does this not clash with everything the drinker seems to believe? Even what he says here would contradict what he says in his video on themes. That bringing your own personal perspective to a work in order to interpret it is a bad thing. Why is it okay to have grayness in a show like Cobra Kai but not in modern fantasy? Does Will actually believe anything? Is he honest or consistent about one single thing?
The two dojos in this show and their respective owners represent two very different philosophies on life, and in some ways, I guess they kind of represent the conflicting forces of present-day American culture.
Again, Will portrays this as a good thing, where I feel in any other project he would hate this. Like Jordan Peele's Us, for example. He hates that movie and a lot of modern horror is so allegorical. But again, he likes this because there's nuance in the way Cobra Kai as a dojo is portrayed. He sees Cobra Kai as representing, quote, the bombastic self-confidence of the 80s, discipline, aggression, drive, and strength, and a hint of resentment towards the modern world and a longing for the glory days of the past, which is what Will claims to be all about. Miyagi-Do, meanwhile, reflects, quote, the more compassionate and liberal climate of the present day, emphasizing balance, harmony, and only fighting when necessary, end quote.
A different show would have had Cobra Kai as the undisputed villains, portraying them as hopelessly infected with toxic masculinity and needing to be taught a lesson by the virtuous Miyagi-Do. But the writers were smart enough to go a different route here. It's a show that's not afraid to poke fun at political correctness or the cotton wool culture that's given birth to a generation of frightened, directionless snowflakes, and it dares to suggest that maybe a bit of old school bravado, discipline, and adversity is what today's kids are really looking for.
So nuance is fine, as long as it doesn't clash with what Will already believes. Will's ultimate interpretation of Cobra Kai is that extremes are bad and balance and compromise is the way forward, which makes it all the stranger to see him review media with extremes. How can Will not see the irony in saying that the lesson of Cobra Kai is a need for balance? Worth noting that Will's video on Cobra Kai came out just after the second season ended. Regardless though, these thoughts on just those 2 seasons are revealing, aren't they? In his stream on Cobra Kai after the series finale, the drinker responds to a super chat that says,
Hippie comment of the day. Cobra Kai is about left and right wing politics, and that we can both learn from each other. Life is about balance. That's what the dojos represent. It's like, you know, the kick-ass, like aggressive way of doing things, or the empathetic, protective way of doing things. Both have value, both have merit of their own, but like you have to find the right time to employ them. And I think that's what the
Combine
end
them.
of the show is.
That's such a laughably ironic take coming from the drinker, and he even backpedals on that take when his guests start to say the show is completely apolitical, even though this was the same take Will had in his video on the first 2 seasons.
I think it's less politics, more like philosophy almost.
And one of Will's guests says you can draw the comparison, but it probably wasn't intended by the writers. But regardless, authorial intent isn't everything, especially with a deconstructionist lens. So once again, whether Will realizes it or not, he is engaging in deconstruction with his commentary on media. Now, before I end this video, I probably don't need to point this out to those of you who can already see through the drinker, but I can't help noting it for anyone who doesn't know him. In all of these videos, Will just can't help being weird about women.
There's Tessa Thompson as Adrian. Bianca. She's the love interest of Creed, and just like Adrian, she's deficient in a way. Whereas Adrian suffered from crippling shyness that held her back from living a full life, Bianca's gradually going deaf because of reasons, which makes being a musician a bit of an odd choice of career, but never mind. There's not much to the character beyond her disability, and I can't say she's helped by the actress playing her. There's something about Tessa Thompson that makes me want to drink toilet duck. Again. I think it's the annoying Tandy Newton smirk she seems to have in every role she plays. It doesn't help that the writing team were more preoccupied with turning every single female character into an invincible girl boss, who's usually gay because of course they are, than crafting an interesting story. But then what do you expect from modern writers? It was actually kind of a shock to have a female lead in a modern big budget movie who isn't an insufferable asshole, but there it is. She plays Penny with warmth and humanity, and holy shit. Talk about an upgrade. I mean, no offense to Kelly McGillis or anything, but damn, I know which one I'd pick. And it's not some laughable DEI instructional video where every single town and village in every part of the world contains the exact same quota of ethnic diversity, so there's absolutely no sense of place or culture anywhere, and where 100-pound teenage girls can somehow beat the shit out of men twice their size and weight.
Yeah, the genre is called fantasy. It's meant to be unrealistic, but I swear, if I see one woman defeat a man in a battle, I'm gonna lose my freaking mind. In any piece of criticism, the critic is always going to reveal something about themselves, whether they like it or not. Everyone has biases and notions that inform their worldviews. And even though Will doesn't seem to want to engage in any self-reflection or analysis, he inadvertently reveals who he is through these videos, or so say I. Then again, since language has no inherent meaning, maybe Will's words are meaningless. And maybe my words are meaningless too. Maybe you should get off of YouTube and go live your life. Or, you can also engage in the powerful play and leave a comment down below. Even though I think deconstruction is a worthy idea in literary criticism, and while I agree that a word can never truly be what it represents, I think it is kind of silly to say that language is inherently meaningless just because words are signifiers. Obviously, language has a purpose, even if it has no inherent meaning. Even though we can draw multiple interpretations from one piece, that doesn't mean analyzing and criticizing it amounts to nothing. It's fun, and again, I know Will agrees, otherwise why would he be a film critic? Does he not enjoy what he does? Well, maybe that would explain a few things. Before we wrap up, let me read this quote from Ian Thompson's essay, Deconstructing the Hero. Even in the darkest of contemporary comics, however, a careful reader can still recognize the sparks from that ongoing struggle to imagine and create the kinds of heroes who will prove themselves capable of inspiring the denizens of this complex and morally ambiguous world. A struggle which seeks to keep alive, as the dream of the hero with all its risks has always done, our hope for a better future. This hope, which really is hope itself, we can deconstruct, but never destroy. I will say, a lot of people think deconstructionist criticism has to be inherently cynical or depressing. And I mean, yeah, that's the direction it often goes because it is an acknowledgement of no inherent meaning. But isn't that what's kind of beautiful about the humanities and language arts? We get to attribute meaning where there might be none inherently, and that's awesome. And to Thompson's point here, even in the most cynical works, we can see sparks of hope and heroism. Something I haven't even pointed out yet is that if the drinker purports to love heroes who are wholly good and who represent the best in us, then shouldn't he love Ray? It just re-demonstrates his line of thinking, where if something is good, it's because it follows a prescriptive rule that he holds true to, and if something is bad, it doesn't. As one of the commenters on my first Critical Drinker video put it, Will exemplifies narrow-mindedness in critique. But what do you think? Do you agree or disagree with the points I've made here? Is there a consistency that I'm missing in Will's arguments? Does he have a point I've failed to see? Please, tell me everything. And hey, if you want to support this channel, I've got merch now. Purchasing some is a great way to help me continue the work I'm doing while getting something in return. And as always, I have to give huge thanks to my patrons. I say it every time, but it's always true. I cannot thank them enough for their support. It means so much to me. If you want to support in non-monetary ways, doing all the algorithm things really helps a lot. Liking, commenting, subscribing, hyping, sharing, being a female protagonist who beats up crowds of men, that sort of thing. You can follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around till the end of the video, have a writing prompt. Today, I want you to write a story or a poem about a person who is a quote-unquote Mary Sue, but I want the text to be aware of that fact. You can interpret that metatextual direction however you like. Does the main character recognize how much power they hold? Do they interact with the narrator or the universe at large? Have they always been a Mary Sue, or was that role thrust upon them? You're free to take it in whatever direction you like. The time is now yours. Get to writing.